Very
Good
fun.
afternoon and welcome to the first of our events to mark the 50th anniversary of the independence of Bangladesh. My name is Nilanjan Sarkar and I'm the Deputy Director of the LSE South Asia Centre. I'm delighted to welcome today a galaxy of scholars who will speak from various perspectives on the birth and the independence of Bangladesh. As I said, this is the first in a series of events. We are doing a series of events through the year, going up to March next year. We are also running a series of blog posts every month and doing a variety of other events, which we hope you will follow. Please follow us on Twitter, on Facebook. You can sign up to our mailing list, and so on and so forth, as usual. I'm not going to spend too much of time talking now because we have a lot to look forward to and listen to. But for the sake of the audience, may I say that all of you who've joined us, thank you very much for signing up. Thank you very much for joining us from across the world, but especially from Bangladesh, from where we have a lot of people watching this. If you would like to ask a question, please feel free to ask the question on Facebook, and I will ask it to a particular panelist. If it is directed to a particular panelist, you can ask a question to the entire panel if you would like. That's absolutely fine. And for the benefit of the audience, please know that the camera of Professor Gary Bass is going to remain switched off for the duration of the event because he would prefer it to be so. So if you see a black box that says Gary Bass, you must know that there is Gary Bass behind that black box. But let me get on now with the very pleasant task of introducing everyone. As it happens, I'm going to begin with introducing Gary Bass, who is Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University. Gary is also the author of The Blood Telegram, Nixon, Kissinger, and the Forgotten Genocide, which was published in 2013. And more recently, last year in September, there was a very interesting follow-up column in the New York Times called The Terrible Cost of Presidential Racism, which focuses on Nixon and Kissinger, but also brought back to attention Gary's very interesting book. And we look forward to hearing from Gary. Dr. Meghna Guhathakurta, for the longest time, taught international relations in the University of Dhaka till 2007, I think, and is currently executive director of the research initiatives in Bangladesh. I'm delighted to say that we have actually hosted Meghna earlier in the summer of, was it 2018, when we had our first LSE UC Berkeley conference, and Meghna had come all the way from Dhaka at that time. Meghna has contributed to this very, very interesting volume called Of the Nation Born, the Bangladesh Papers, which was published in 2016, edited by Hamida Hussain and Amina Mohsin. And I invited Meghna because I was very keen to hear what she had to say from her perspective. Nayanika Mookherjee is Professor of Anthropology at Durham University here in the United Kingdom and is author of The Spectral Wounds, Sexual Violence, Public Memories, and the Bangladesh War of 1971. Nayanika has also made a very interesting film, which I have had the privilege to see, on ethical testimonies of sexual violence during conflict. It's very important because of the ethical questions that are involved in gathering this kind of evidence, especially for anthropologists. And I'm delighted to say that Nayanika is actually going to show a clip from that film later when she speaks. Srinath Raghavan is Professor at Ashoka University in International Relations and History, and is the author of 1971, A Global History of the Creation of Bangladesh, which was published in 2013. Yasmin Saikia joins us from Arizona. Yasmin is Professor in History and Hart Nikachos Chair in Peace Studies at the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict at Arizona State University. Yasmin, in 2011, published Women, War, and the Making of Bangladesh, Remembering 1971. Last but certainly not the least, Salil Tripathi, who is based in New York, is a journalist and writer, is contributing editor to Caravan and Mint, and also chairs the PEN International's Writers in Prison Committee. Salil is the author of The Colonel Who Would Not Repent, The Bangladesh War and Its Unquiet Legacy, which was published in 2016, and around which we had a very interesting discussion, I'm sure Salil remembers, with Martin Woolacott, the Guardian correspondent who reported from Dhaka in 1971. Katie Gardner is professor in anthropology at LSE. And before I say more, I must say something that I always say, which is Katie is also an alumnus of LSE, having done her PhD in the Department of Anthropology, though she then went away and then came back as professor. Her specialism is in Bangladesh, and she has authored several books, of which I mention only two over here. The one in 1995, which I've read, is Global Migrants, Local Lives, Travel and Transformation in Rural Bangladesh. Her most recent publication, though, in 2012, is Discordant Development, Global Capitalism and the Struggle for Connection in Bangladesh. And Katie's currently working on marital problems, divorce and counseling in Dhaka. So without saying anything more, I'm now going to invite Srinath to make his opening remarks. For the benefit of the audience, I say that we have decided in advance the order in which the speakers will speak, after which we'll open it up for discussion, and we look forward to your questions. Srinath.
Thank you, Nilanjan, for that kind introduction and the opportunity to be here today. Delighted to be with so many distinguished friends, colleagues, and to see people who have sort of written about this subject with much greater insight than I to be on this panel. And thanks to everyone, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, for being here today. In some ways, I'd assume that my work on Bangladesh is perhaps the most traditional of the many kinds of books that have been written by people who are sitting on this panel here with me today. As I wrote this book as a historian, particularly as an international historian of the subcontinent, Asia, and I was quite keen on trying to understand how the story of the creation of Bangladesh, not just in the year 1971, but in and around that period, broadly fits into the international history of the second half of the 20th century and its development during that time. And the reason I chose that particular angle to talk about the subject was a certain set of dissatisfaction, as it were, with the existing ways in which the story of becoming Bangladesh had been told up until that time. As I saw it, and in some ways as I continue to see it, that story is broadly told as one which is, in its most general outlines, quite a deterministic story, which is to say that the creation of an independent Bangladesh out of the two wings of Pakistan was more or less an inevitable fact, simply because of the realities of geography, the fact that the two parts of East Pakistan had a very lopsided economic relationship, the fact of political dominance of West Pakistan over East Pakistan, and the salient facts of long cultural differences in what was considered to be the homeland for the Muslims of the subcontinent, but actually encompassed many different cultures. And I think the one single line which perhaps encapsulates this argument best is from Salman Rushdie's novel Shame, where he says that united Pakistan was that strange bird, two wings without a body, sundered by the homeland of its greatest enemy and united by nothing but God. So in a very real sense, I think it is this kind of determinism and a teleology within the writing of the history, the creation or the emergence of an independent state, that I wanted to examine. And my argument in the book really is that if you want to understand the causes and the course of events which led to the emergence of an independent Bangladesh, then we would do well to take a shorter time horizon, not assume that this was somehow prescripted in 1947. This was not a chronicle of a birth foretold at the creation of Pakistan itself, something which really starts taking shape from the late 1960s onwards. And in order to be able to understand all the causalities in play, we need to bring the international dimension front and center and not just treat this as a subcontinental affair. So that really was the sort of the polemical point of view from which I came to this. And the argument really is quite simple. I argue in the book that we need to keep in mind three broad sets of international processes and factors which played into the creation of Bangladesh. The first, of course, was the phenomenon of decolonization itself, which had been accelerating through the 1960s. And in some ways, you could quite really see Bangladesh as another instance of decolonization playing out within the subcontinent, which had had one such instance already in 1947. But by the time we're talking about the late 60s and the early 70s, decolonization itself had kind of taken a very different kind of turn, which is the sheer number of countries which had come out and were being considered as part of what you would now call the global south, right? So there is a very clear north-south divide, which is emerging in international politics, which comes to be symbolized by things like the call for a new international economic order in 1974, etc. But I think the moment of creation of Bangladesh really has to be understood within that context of a very clear emergence of the post-colonial world with the process of decolonization. The second, to my mind, very important phenomenon is the transformative moment during the Cold War itself. Now, the Cold War begins and in some ways ends also in Europe, but its hottest spots were always outside of Europe. And in many ways, the late 1960s, early 70s was another conjuncture where older Cold War alignments were being prized apart and being reconfigured in new ways. The emerging relationship between the United States and China, just at the moment when the Bangladesh crisis erupts, really, in the summer of 1971, is of course one example of it. But at the same time, there is a reconfiguration of intra-bloc politics across the place, which also allows for space for previously non-aligned countries like India to be able to make strategic relationships with the Soviet Union, the other pole in the Cold War. So that again is a particular moment and a particular conjuncture without which we really cannot start understanding why the 1971 crisis took the peculiar turns that it did. Perhaps most important of all was that in the early 70s is also the time when we see the beginning of another wave of globalization. So historians like me, particularly economic historians who are interested in global connections and transformations, tend to think of globalization as something that it ebbs and flows over periods of time. And in the post-Second World War period, it is now quite clearly established that the early 70s marked one such period of acceleration, interconnection between different parts of the world. And that meant not just increases in trade, investment flows, or movement of people, but equally important, the movement of ideas and the flow of, the ability to understand the social processes which are playing in one part of the world have their counterparts, and similar processes are playing out in other parts of the world. And the Bangladesh crisis, once again, was very much a product of globalization, and it was shaped by globalization itself. Just to give you one quick example, and I'll bring it to a close thereafter. If there is really a point at which the demand for autonomy for East Pakistan becomes something closer to a claim for self-determination in the total sense, it's really from 1969 with the fall of Ayub Khan, which was, of course, led by students and the youth of both East and West Pakistan. But we should remember that this is part of a broader global conjuncture. 1968 is a global phenomenon with the rise of youth and youth politics as a very new social force, so to speak. And what we see happening in the context of East Pakistan or Bangladesh is very much one instantiation of the phenomenon. Similarly, I mean, if you look at the ways in which the crisis was played out, it was played out very much for an international and a transnational audience. Various actors, people from Bangladesh itself who were not just located within the country but elsewhere, made very conscious attempts to reach out to a much larger global public, to use the emergent vocabularies of humanitarian action as well as human rights in certain ways. I'm sure Gary will speak to that point. And all of these were in some ways inconceivable, say, if the same crisis had played out over 10 years ago. So it is in this sense, really, that I believe that the peculiar conjuncture of decolonization, a certain moment in the Cold War, and the emergence of globalization really played a decisive role in shaping the emergence of Bangladesh, which is why I would continue to hold that this was not something predetermined. It was a product of conjuncture and contingency, of choice as well as chance. But I think its outcome was decisive. And 50 years on, we are in a much better position to see clearly what were the historical forces that propelled the creation of this independent country. Thank you.
Thank you, Srinath. Gary, would you like to speak? Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm deeply honored to be here at the LSE, which has such a wonderful tradition of studying Asia, South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia. And I'm especially honored to be here with these extraordinary panelists. It's like looking at all the footnotes in some of the stuff I've been writing for the past several years. They're now gathered around me, so deeply honored for that. My book is about the Bangladesh struggle in its international context, and I come at it in some ways that are similar to Srinath. I'm a political scientist as well as a diplomatic historian, and as a political scientist, somebody who works on the politics of human rights, it's a story about how two of the world's biggest and most powerful democracies, India and the United States, coped with one of the worst human rights crises of the Cold War. As a work of diplomatic history, it's kind of a correction to public memory in the United States and in India. But this is obviously this sort of great power context is only one angle of this story. And I think that's what's wonderful about this panel is that we're getting all of these perspectives, including crucially, a full narrative needs to tell the Bangladeshi story too. That when you're talking about international relations, there's an inherent focus on great powers, but I think that's normatively troubling. And even though it's sort of standard in my discipline, I do think it's important to remember that that's not the only part of this story. So the American story sort of inverts the standard narrative about the promotion of human rights. Since the work of David Wyman and Samantha Power, Americans have a tendency to think about the debates about human rights in terms of sins of omission. Of there's, the narrative is there's something terrible happening in some part of the world, and the question is why the United States isn't doing more to step in. So thinking about Bill Clinton standing by during the genocide in Rwanda. But this is a case, and some of those questions apply to India's response, where India has powerfully mixed motives, a mix of strategic motives in wanting to dismember Pakistan, but also genuinely, humanitarian motives bubbling up from the Indian public. But in the case of the United States, it's a case where the United States is intervening. There's no question of whether or not the United States should be intervening because the United States is actively involved under Nixon and Kissinger, knowingly supporting the murderous regime at most of the key moments. Nixon and Kissinger know all about what is happening on the ground. There's massive reporting from the United States consulate in Dhaka about what's happening, led by the consul general there, Archer Blood, giving detailed reporting about widespread atrocities. And the American diplomats in Dhaka have a powerful career incentive to keep their mouths shut, that they know that Pakistan is a Cold War ally, that the military junta that's carrying out this these atrocities is a Cold War ally of the United States, and yet they're providing the information in great detail. Ken Keating, the ambassador to India, former Republican senator from New York, confronts Nixon and Kissinger in the Oval Office in June 1971, saying explicitly, it is almost entirely a matter of genocide, killing the Hindus. Kissinger makes numerous references to the atrocities and the singling out of the Hindu minority within what is then East Pakistan. When he briefs the White House staff about Yahya Khan sneaking him into Beijing on his trip there from Pakistan in July 1971, Kissinger says, the cloak and dagger exercise in Pakistan arranging the trip was fascinating. Yahya hasn't had such fun since the last Hindu massacre. So he is well aware and even making jokes. Part of what I think is confounding about this is that even though Nixon and Kissinger have tried to claim themselves as sort of apostles of realpolitik, realism has a hard time explaining their policies that you can understand from a sort of realpolitik realpolitik perspective, why American presidents, including Eisenhower, including Kennedy, would dislike Nehru's non-alignment. But what's hard to understand is the poisonous anger that Nixon and Kissinger display towards India and towards the Bengalis at these moments. You're not expecting Nixon and Kissinger to be human rights idealists. You don't expect them to be, Tony Blinken. But you don't expect them to hand Pakistan a blank check and say, do absolutely whatever you want to your public. We don't care. Nixon and Kissinger are masters of leverage, and yet they have substantial leverage over Pakistan. I'm not saying that they have control over Pakistan, but you might have thought they might have tried out some of the standard tools of American statecraft and see if they had any difference. So conditionality, to say if you start wiping out a chunk of your own population, you may not get as much military aid. Or taking them aside and trying to persuade them, saying that this is going to be a losing proposition. India will be in a position to resupply the Mukti Bahini, to promote an insurgency against you. Pakistan having to resupply from West Pakistan is unlikely to be able to crush this insurgency. This is a bad idea. And you see very little of that. And much of what my book tries to do is reconstruct the decisions that Nixon and Kissinger made, not as they, after the fact, claimed that they did, but by digging into the White House tapes and finding out exactly what was driving their decisions. Now, this is harder to do because of secrecy in the United States, which is a much bigger problem, in fact, in India and Pakistan. It's even harder, as hard as it is to get records in the United States, it's even harder to get them in Pakistan. And it's also tough to get them in India. The Indian government, despite the best efforts of historians like Srinath, still does a pretty good job of covering up exactly how Mrs. Gandhi made her decisions. The Nixon White House bleeped out stuff on the White House tapes and tried to keep that stuff private. And I spent about 7 years trying to get some of these tapes unbleeped even afterwards. And that's what recently, even after the publication of my book, I managed to get some of the stuff that was bleeped out. And these things are supposed to be bleeped out on the grounds of national security, that it is damaging to the national security of the United States. And what I found is that this stuff was bleeped out not for any legitimate, not for any lawful purpose, but just because it's embarrassing, because it makes Nixon and Kissinger look bad. I think it's singularly revealing to historians that it shows the extent to which they are driven not by realpolitik, but by racism. So these are some of the things that were just unbleeped because I have tenure and therefore I can afford to spend 7 years having fights. In June 1971, Nixon says, and I'm quoting him, "Undoubtedly the most unattractive women in the world are the Indian women, undoubtedly. The most sexless, nothing, these people. I mean, people say, what about the Black Africans? Well, you can see something, the vitality there. I mean, they have a little animal-like charm, but God, those Indians act pathetic." That's Nixon. That's the president of the United States. In November 1971, during his summit with Indira Gandhi, he says, "To me, they turn me off. How the hell do they turn other people on, Henry? Tell me." You can't hear what Henry Kissinger says in response to that, but then Nixon continues, "They turn me off. They are repulsive, and it's just easy to be tough with them." Again, that's Nixon. Kissinger, who's tried to portray himself as being above the bigotry of the Nixon White House, but the tapes show him joining in. In June 1971, about Indians, he says, "They are a scavenging people." And you can hear on the tapes the tone of disgust. And he is similarly racist towards Pakistanis. In August 1971, in a discussion of whether or not Yahya Khan should execute Mujib, Kissinger says, the Pakistanis are fine people, but they are primitive in their mental structure. When I was writing my book, I had the Pakistanis are fine people, and then it was bleeped, so I didn't know. Now we know that what was bleeped out is, but they are primitive in their mental structure. So that is what the project was about, is an attempt to correct public memory. But it's important to realize that part of the reason why public memory about this is wrong in the United States is because of the extent to which Nixon and Kissinger worked assiduously to cover up what they actually did. So with that, many thanks. And I look forward to the other panelists who know much more about this than I do.
Thank you, Gary. Meghna is next for us to listen to, but Meghna, I'm not sure if you're, yes, you're there. Oh, great, there you are. So would you like to speak now, Meghna?
Yeah, I will be very brief because my internet connection is not too stable. So, but I would really love to engage in more conversation with the panelists, with the chair, or you know, to talk a little bit more. So I'll just lay out the basic sketch. Thank you for inviting me specifically on a topic that I really love to talk about, which is about sexual violence and impunity. The book that you mentioned, Of the Nation Born, was actually edited by Hamida Hussein and Amina Mohsen, was actually on sexual violence and impunity in general, not necessarily on 1971. But I started my academic career on working with gender-based violence in the 80s. And I've been doing that ever since, you know, off and on in different perspectives. This has been basically, you know, one of the basic trends in my research. It still is. And when I was asked by the editors to write overall kind of a conceptual basis of the, it is an anthology. So, and with a lot of very illustrious names in that, contributors to the book. And so I was very interested in working and in also reflecting some of my thoughts on sexual violence and impunity all through the years that I've been working on, from the 80s to the current stage in Bangladesh. So basically, my feelings about it, I talk about both my own experiences as well as draw on the lessons from the contributors themselves. So sexual violence and impunity are integral to the history of Bangladesh. The 1971 Liberation War was foundational in shaping the discourse on sexual violence in Bangladesh, and it has taken two forms in the political discourse. One was to inscribe women's proactive role in the war within the male-dominant nationalist paradigm, and redefine rape and sexual violence as visible crimes against humanity. Second was the more subtle, and exists still in an embryonic form, works which engage with feminist notions that contest nationalist paradigms and seek solutions beyond the nationalist symbols or parameters. Finding a feminist perspective of sexual violence of the Liberation War has begun, but it's still very much embryonic. We're in the panel itself, there's Nayanika Mookherjee, and also a very well-established researcher, Brina Di Costa's work is very pioneering in this aspect. About nationalist paradigms, often in the discourse, we see that the collective memories are all too often conflated with national memories or national consciousness. But in my subsequent research on sexual violence, I have also looked at the Chittagong Hill tracks, and I've looked at sexual violence in that particular context. And I've seen that the markers of the individual or subaltern group, markers of consciousness, can be very different from respective national polemics. And they are also gendered. For example, what we think about the Ershad regime, the Jia regime, the Mujib regime, as markers.
Oh dear, I think we might have just lost Meghna's connection there. We'll just wait for Meghna to come back, but shall we, Yasmin, would you like to speak, and perhaps Meghna could take over once after you have finished, if that is fine, and I'll send Meghna a message saying that we'll wait for her to reconnect. Would that be fine?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you, Nilanjan. So thank you so much. I would like to thank the organizers for actually starting this discussion in this inaugural session, my co-panelists from all over the world now, and particularly the audience for listening to us and hopefully will engage us in rethinking about how do we remember the war of Bangladesh in 1971. As we all know, and I think this whole panel is discussing this issue of how tumultuous the war of 1971 was in East Pakistan, today Bangladesh, and the memories that have developed in consequence of it, not just in the subcontinent, but also, as Gary talked about, in the US. The previous presentations that you already heard have addressed about these international Cold War politics, the big leaders, including Kissinger and Nixon and Indira Gandhi and Yahya and all kinds of people, and their roles in East and West, in the wars in East and West Pakistan, Pakistan and India, and as Meghna had just started, the struggles of Bangladesh's national nation building from the arena of rethinking sexual violence along with class and ethnicity. In my research, although I have been mindful of 1971 as a field of conflict and war, my central focus was the memories of ordinary and vulnerable people. Since the time that is allotted to us is only 6 minutes, I cannot engage in the very wide kind of layered memories of the liberation war in Bangladesh, nor the international war between India and Pakistan, or the memories of the civil war between pro-Pakistani Urdu-speaking Rajakars and the Bengali Mukti Bahini militia. I will focus on only one aspect of the silence of the unclaimed victims and perpetrators' memories and the struggle with the noisy national histories. Given that memory, like history, is a construct, the memories of 1971 are steeped in layers of recollections. I have refused to take sides with one set of memories over another. My interactions with victims and perpetrators, women and men, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and non-denominational groups from Pakistan, from Bangladesh and India have made me appreciate them as human survivors. I have tried to dialogue with the different strands of conflicting and conflictual memories to reflect on how ordinary people experienced the wars of 1971 and what happened in consequence. By ordinary people, I mean those who did not have decision-making power, but enacted the orders of those who controlled the state machinery or were simply bystanders. The most vulnerable among the ordinary people were women and children. In my book, I focus on the victims, mostly women from East Pakistan, and perpetrators from West Pakistan. One might ask if I designate a specific group as victims and conversely, another specific group as perpetrators. The enemy, I have argued, did not typify a kind, Pakistani soldiers. Bengali and so-called Bihari Rajakars, neighbors, friends, and even family members betrayed one another during the war. This was particularly evident in women's speech who refused to label their perpetrators, but contextualized their indignity as violence committed by one human on another. The women who were sexually victimized cannot forget the destruction of their bodies, even when they try to. Their pain is ontological, but today it is epistemic because the official history of Bangladesh claims their memories for representing the Pakistanis as the perpetrators. However, Bangladesh's national history has not encouraged Biranganas or survivors of sexual violence to claim their place among the heroes of the war. Instead, societal rejection has forced many of them into silence. The memories of women who broke the imposed silence and spoke to me are intensely personal. Violence in 1971, they recounted, was everywhere. They asked for understanding of their experiences and relate to them as human beings rather than play the blame game. What about the perpetrators' memories? Curiously, the perpetrators too, who were willing to discuss the human side of the war, did not see themselves as heroes. This does not mean, nor am I saying, that victims and perpetrators share a similar memory. Neither is their pain the same. As Colonel Nader Ali recalled, Pakistanis killed many more than the Bengalis did. We had lost our mind. Men like Nader Ali was haunted by the memories of the violence and could not celebrate Pakistanis' bravery in killing and violating in the war. Likewise, Kajol in Chittagong told me nationalism made me into a brute. I realize this now. A void in memory has been created for perpetrators, Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, and it is in the abyss of their hearts that an impossible realization of the loss of insaniyat, manavikata, or humanity has taken shape. This is a devastating memory. The state of Pakistan has shunned this memory into public amnesia. The Hamidur Rahman Commission made a feeble attempt to probe the activities of the army, but Bhutto refused to make the findings public. Public forgetfulness and private pain entered the source of history in Pakistan even as it was made. Likewise, in Indian official history, the people's experiences have disappeared, except as a political rhetoric of humanitarian response. But today, the refugees of 1971 who stayed behind are called infiltrators. The term Bangladeshi is used as the hated other in India, particularly against Muslim Bengalis in Assam. At the heart of memory, both official and social, is forgetting, the loss of the event of trauma and the loss generated by active forgetting. It is this gap of history that I have been interested in searching. Survivors' speech of the loss of insaniyat questions and opens the space for another level of interrogation of official histories. It illuminates a powerful truth to search for the common ground of humanity and invokes our agency while making us aware of the precarious human condition. The survivor's language of humanity enabled me to write a people's history of the war without the barrier of flags. If we heed to survivors, a possible closure is possibly there, but without the victims and perpetrators speaking in their voices, no matter how much we talk in academic sites, there is no moving forward. We cannot become without acknowledging the loss of others who suffered and live in pain every day. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin. We're delighted. Meghna, are you back?
I am back, yes.
Okay, great. Would you like to continue, please? We decided to bring Yasmin in because I wasn't sure that you could reestablish the connection, but please continue.
Well, actually, I wouldn't like to continue for a long time. As I said, I like to engage in conversation with others. So if in the discussion, you could bring whatever I wanted to say, I could say it then. Okay?
Sure, but I mean, you were mid-sentence earlier. Would you like to continue?
Well, I was talking about collective memories being often conflated with national consciousness. And that's why the study beyond the national beyond the national paradigm is very important for feminists, is to talk about the intertwining of gender and ethnicity and to intersectionality, and also to look at different aspects of, say, militarization or land grabbing from a gendered perspective. So perhaps that is the way that And I was going to say that that is the way that future scholarships has great potential in Bangladesh, as not only scholarship, but also in the discursive practice of feminist movements. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Meghna, and thanks again for making the effort to rejoin. And yes, we will I'm sure come back to this these topics and themes in the discussion. If it helps you, I mean, you're absolutely free to keep your camera off if it helps your connectivity for the moment, and maybe join in when the discussion starts. That would be great, because we'd love to have you here.
Okay, thank you. We'll do that then. Yeah.
Salil, would you like to start, please? Thanks.
Yeah. So thanks very much. Yeah, again, like others have said, it's a pleasure and honor to be on this panel, because again, these are, all of you are people from whom I've learned much and listened much. And I should say that with the obvious fact that, you know, I have approached this story and this book not as a historian and not as a scholar, because I'm neither. I'm a journalist, I'm a storyteller. I know how to listen, and I try to capture it and write to understand what happened. I come as a well-wisher of the people who were victims, who are the survivors, and I also accept that leaderships are imperfect. They change their views, they miss opportunities in front of them. There are what ifs in historical scenarios that need to be dug into and explored further. And we end up reaching forks of history, which ends up dictating directions which may seem right or wrong. And it's only later that we can try to make sense of what happened, as if there was a grand design. And too many of the answers are not yet known. Too many of the questions, the wounds of that time still remain festering, and versions and narratives are still being raised as questions. So those are the kind of things that brought me into it. I wanted to meet those who remembered the war and what happened, who wanted to prevent its recurrence, and who was benefiting from it. And I was extremely conscious that I was an outsider looking in. I was not from Bangladesh. I was speaking for nobody but myself, and claimed not to speak for others either. But I hoped that by listening to them and giving voice to what they said, I would be able to make some sense of the history for me and for others who are curious about that part. Because I think one thing that, you know, we are all conscious of is that I grew up in India. I was 9 years old at the time of the war. And in India at that time, and even later, it was always seen as the Indo-Pak war. And the offshoot of that was Bangladesh, as something that happened, but it was never the main theme of what was being talked about. And among the nationalist Indians, that there was always a view that Bangladesh should be grateful for what happened and what India did for it. And that has colored Indian thinking over the years, and continues to color that thinking. Pakistan, on the other hand, blamed India for breaking up the country. Again, what happened in Bangladesh was of less consequence to them. But what about the Bangladeshis, and what were their stories, and what was their agency? So to understand that, and to understand those voices and the subtleties, I went there. I mean, I was in Lahore talking about the book, and I thought I was making a point when I said that, you know, we have this situation where I'm quite sure that, you know, the army and the people had different views. And Asma Jahangir corrected me. I mean, she actually told me that, no, it is not the case. When she was at the mall in Lahore, trying to get signature from people in Pakistan to oppose the war, she got only 51 signatures in a nation of what was at that time 70 million, 80 million. I don't remember the exact population figure there, but you know exactly what she was getting at that time. And I'm glad Yasmin brought up Colonel Nadir Ali, who died recently, in fact, and you know, trying to express remorse. You know, the nation which he wanted to atone for what the nation had done to the others. Those were the kind of stories I wanted to hear. It remains a contentious history. It becomes difficult to question in Bangladesh today how many people actually died in the war, and whether it is, the figure is 3 million, whether it is less, whether it is more. If you say that, you almost commit something that sounds criminal, as sedition. So those were the kind of ideas which were, you know, creating an official version of truth. I wanted to question that as well. So the colonel that I speak about in my book, the colonel who would not repent, was actually Colonel Furukraman. He's a man who was mastermind of the mutiny, or you know, the rebellion that he led on 15th August 1975 after the war, and, you know, instrumental in the assassination of you know, the Sheikh Mujib family, most of it. I mean, in fact, and how that happened, and why is it that he was unrepentant, and why that happened. Those were the kind of questions that led me to it. There were other personal reasons I was curious about. What makes a nation? Is it faith or language? There's a wonderful poem by Tarfia Faizullah, the Bangladeshi American poet, where she talks about a woman being raped. And at that time, she is constantly asked by the soldier that, what are you, Bengali or Muslim? And she keeps saying both. And it is this inability to understand that both which was leading to the nation. I was curious about it. I wanted to know more about that. I worked several years at Amnesty International. So human rights abuses at a collective level are of great interest to me. What happens when the war is over? What kind of mechanism can be there for remedies? Is it retributive justice or restorative justice? These are concepts that I was struggling with. And it was Meghna, one of the witnesses of the war, who I write about in my book, who actually told me about it, and he distinguished it between the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as one way of dealing with it, and war crimes tribunals as the other way of dealing with it. How Bangladesh was coping with it as a remedy mechanism. Other things I wanted to know was about, non-violent students who are being attacked. The women, I went, to understand their dignity, their inherent courage, and respected their view. And I went and listened to about 30 women whose stories are captured in the story. And it was a very humbling experience. And to stay with that story, and Nayanika has done a lot of work on that with Spectral Wound. We will hear about it shortly after me. There is a film, Rising Silence, which has been made about it. So all of those things, and how to reconcile with mass atrocities. I mean, there was conversation about Clinton and Rwanda earlier when Gary talked about it, but you also have the whole situation of Yugoslavia. What is an appropriate moral intervention? Was India right in intervening? Are some interventions justified? The Iraq war has made it virtually impossible now for a country to intervene in another country's affairs, even if there are mass atrocities. And Rwanda was missed, of course. Bosnia was another case like that. But there have been cases where there have been interventions which have been useful. Was what Vietnam did in Cambodia right? What the British Army did in Sierra Leone right? What India did in Bangladesh was right? These are all questions that we will continue to ponder over. What makes a nation? What constitutes the identity? And the book ends, of course, in 2011 and 12 with the Shahbag protests and so on. But those questions still remain. I mentioned the fact that, how many people have actually died remains a question that is controversial. What has become of Bangladesh is controversial too, about, is Bangladesh today what it was meant to be? Look at the poem that Asad Chowdhury writes, and which is at the Riot Bazaar. Is Bangladesh's leadership today speaking the language that we wanted to hear, that the martyrs wanted to hear? Is it the same thing that we are hearing now? That's another question. How Bangladesh looks at refugees from elsewhere. It's a nation that understands what being refugee means. And it was a beneficiary of the international system in one way. How is it reacting with the Rohingyas who are coming in? These are the perpetuating questions that we have about Bangladesh, which we need to continue to grapple with. And also India has to look at it. It continues to say and believe that, those who came never went back. But then when I'm at the Red Cross archives in Geneva, I find that about 90% had returned by the 1st of April 1972. So if that is the situation, then what kind of politics is being played out and what kind of myths are being made? These are the kind of questions that I continue to stay engaged with, but my book does end at an earlier point. Thank you.
Thank you, Salil. I'm going to invite Nayanika now, but before that, just for the benefit of the audience, could I say that there are some people in the audience who've been commenting on why they have not been able to see Gary, and that it was sounding like a voiceover, but I just in case you have joined later, I had announced at the beginning that Gary was going to have his camera switched off at all times of his preference, but he's very much there, and you are free and welcome to pose questions to him as well. Nayanika.
Thank you, Nilanjan. I'm very, very honored to be part of this gathering of speakers. This is the first time I've been invited to speak at the center, and to be part of this event is amazing. At the same time, and I want to pick up from Salil and Yasmin's intake in terms of thinking about perpetrators, and actually within my own teaching career, I've come across various Pakistani students who have come over to kind of get my book signed and gone back. And there's been a lot of groundswell of interest in Pakistan among the younger generation. And there is a bigger part of the civil society as well who are very much engaged in the 1971 war and its injustices. And in fact, in March, I'm speaking at a conference in Pakistan on 1971. So, and I'm hoping some of those colleagues are here as well. So there is groundswell of discussion going on in Pakistan as well, particularly among the younger generation. And another thing that I think there's a kind of kind of subcontinental issue which we need to kind of address as well. And it reminds me something I mentioned in the first page of Spectral Wound, when a well-meaning Scandinavian aid worker sent some ski clothing to Bangladesh as a kind of care package. And one of the Bangladeshi social workers said, oh, maybe they don't know where Bangladesh is. Maybe it's in between Burma and Thailand. Maybe it's in the Himalayas. And so there's a kind of confusion about what the nature of Bangladesh is. And maybe there is some disquiet and maybe hurt about this predominantly being a panel where only Meghna is Bangladeshi. And maybe there's something, Nilanjan, maybe you could address. I think a lot of people in the audience would like to know about that in terms of the configuration of the panel as well. And so I'm very conscious about that. And this is something which has always been very important for me in my own research, doing this research as an Indian, with feminist sensibilities. I start thinking about this issue after the 1992 Ayodhya attack on Babri Masjid. I was born after the war. I go to Bangladesh, and it is, for me, my book is not just a focus on sexual violence, but it is actually about the public memories of sexual violence during the Bangladesh War of 1971. And it triangulates work with survivors, their families, their children, their communities, as well as a huge array of literary and visual representations within Bangladesh, which has existed in Bangladesh since 1971 onwards till today. So the literary and the visual realm has really existed, even though when it fell out of journalistic and state rhetoric. And along with that, I triangulated with the human rights activists and civil society activists. So that's a triangulation my work is and where the book is. And what has been interesting for me is to turn this book also into a graphic novel and an animation film, a brief clip of which I want to show. And because ethical issues are not just a concern of anthropologists, as Nilanjan was saying, but actually it comes up as an issue for writers, historians, journalists, filmmakers, anyone dealing with these concerns, which are of concern. So one of the things that became important for me, and there are three departures in some ways my book makes, and I really argue for a public memory, not a silence of this history, because primarily it's about the very fact that 6 days after the war, Kamruzaman announced in December 1971 that the women who were raped would be called Viranganas. Whatever there were manifestations of it was, it is unprecedented till now in global history in terms of wartime rape. Also, when in Bangladesh, when you go, you have a huge array of photographs, advertisements of exhibits, quote unquote, in museums, testimonials of women, particularly in the 1990s. So, there has been, and in talking about films and literature and theater, films like of the 70s, as well as much later, younger generation of filmmakers today, like Farzana Bobby's Bishkata, or Catherine Tariq Masood's War and Women, or Yasmin Kabir's Aroti Shadhinota. These are trailblazing films that have been made, as well as Shamim Akhtar's film Itihash Korna. So a lot of films have been made in Bangladesh, and there is a huge public archive of it. But one of the things I found was the image of the Bangladeshi woman, the Virangana, was primarily coming up as a horrific image, an image who could only be understood through her wound of either have gone affected physically or outside her configurations. What I find in my own ethnography and research among the survivors is that, and this was across Bangladesh, not just in one area there was much more concentrated, but also across Bangladesh, is that many of them were living with their family members, and they were not just focusing on 1971. So it became really important for me to look at what they were addressing, and they did not want to talk about 1971. And this was very important for me to understand the socialities of violence with which women have continued to live, not being ostracized, being able to talk about it for various sets of reasons. I'm not saying talking is therapeutic and emancipatory, but they were talking about it for various sets of reasons itself. So I think we need to go beyond this silence and giving light kind of binary, which has been important for me to highlight. And I say it's important for me to highlight because also and the way in which the women talk about their Mala Itihash, Chorom Itihash, it's a lot of history, a severe history, because in some ways we need to ask ourselves how the testimony was collected. And this is something that comes from the women, the survivors, their family members, because that testimony collection itself became a second process of transgression on the part of the women's experience and the survivors' experience. So as a final question, I would like to, in a way, I ask that, can we imagine a Birangana without a wound? Can we think of a survivor of sexual violence without those kind of existing of something which we cannot see her beyond those marked features itself? So, and this has implications on everyday sexual violence that we face, and how the subjectivity of the survivor is constructed. And so 71 is not just linked only to a kind of a atomized history, but it links up to how it is understood in today's say anti-rape protests that happened last year. And if people are saying that, you know, if authorities are saying that if you don't talk about it too much, because then it'll increase more. If we have these kind of frameworks about sexual violence, then that kind of constructs a certain subjectivity of sexual violence of the survivor, whom we can only imagine in a horrific way. We need to think of the survivor through the various socialities of violence, and that is what I've tried to do in Spectral Wounds. And this is one of the clips I want to show, but also talk about a brief example of one of the survivors, one of the Biranganas, whom I call Shireen. She was one of the women who got a job in one of the government departments right after the war. Shireen loses her husband during the war. She was pregnant. She gets raped, and she loses her child as well. But she marries her cousin after the war because that was the best option at that point for her. And in some ways, she's also marrying someone whom she did not really love. Her love was for her childhood sweetheart. But at the same time, her second husband knows that actually Shireen is in love with the first husband, to the extent Shireen could only keep the photograph of her first husband in her office cupboard, because her husband was jealous of the first love. And this is where Shireen feels that she cannot even talk about the love that she had for her first husband, which was taken away by the rape of the war. Now, this is something you cannot think about in those horrific frameworks, but the kind of the depth of pain of what Shireen feels in terms of not being able to talk about and having to hide the fact who her love for her first husband from her second husband is actually something what I refer to as a socialities of violence. And if I have I don't know if I have a little bit of moment to show that 1 minute clip, I want to show an account of where it comes from the animation film, which is based on the graphic novel. It's 1326. Yeah. Is the sound there? Can we play the clip?
Of her love for her childhood sweetheart, her deceased first husband. Hence, she kept the photograph of her first husband in her cupboard at work. A few years ago, she retired from her job. Marjina Khatun, hospital cleaner. During the war, Marjina's brother was going away to fight. He had recently married. Look after my wife, elder sister.
When the Pakistani military came to their house, Marjina hid her sister-in-law and another beautiful cousin and put herself forward.
Where are the women in the house?
I'm here. You can take me.
Get into the jeep outside. For 4 months, every night, a military jeep came to pick her up to be raped and dropped her back in the morning. Send Marjina. Don't go, Marjina.
I have to go, or they will find the other women. After the war, neighbors referred to her as a collaborator, and so she left for Dhaka to find work. When I heard we were called Biranganas, I did not tell anyone, but I glowed with pride.
She married, had children, later got separated from her husband. And today, her children have government jobs. She worked as a cleaner in a government hospital and has recently retired.
The military took me by force, but they got nothing from me.
Thank you.
I'm feeling very sad after.
I'll stop there in terms of highlighting the way in which we need to think about wartime sexual violence and their effects on women and their families and communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Nayanika. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Thank you, everyone. Katie is going to take over now, but Nayanika, you raised the point about the selection of panelists. I know you have tweeted about it. Professor Elora Shahabuddin has sent me a letter shortly before this event began, which includes the name of several others, and I have acknowledged the email telling her that I will reply as soon as I can, because I was just going to get, start this event. And I will copy all of you into that reply, so all of you will see. The letter has also been put up on the Facebook chat, which is absolutely fine and absolutely the right thing to do. But I hope that the reply that we send will be circulated widely enough for those who have seen the letter to be able to see the reply as well. But as I'm sure all of you will agree, this is probably not the place to discuss that. Thank you.
Sure, I haven't seen that letter.
Okay, well, thanks so much to everybody for your presentations. Absolutely fascinating and moving and disturbing and also infuriating in terms of what, I mean, no more than infuriating what Gary told us. I mean, just, I'm utterly horrified and aghast. Maybe I shouldn't be. But I wanted to, I've got a couple of general questions, but I gather from Nilanjan that we also have a lot of questions on Facebook. So I don't want to spend lots of time on my questions. I think it'd be much nicer to throw it open to our audience on Facebook and have more participation. But the first question I wanted to ask, which I think is really to pick up on what Meghna was saying, and really also very much to pick up on your presentation, Nayanika, which is really to ask about the ways in which the events of 1971, I mean, the general question was how these have played out in Bangladesh now in, aged 50. But I think the specific question is, Meghna, you were saying that, that 1971 was foundational for putting particular issues of gendered violence on the agenda within Bangladesh and in terms of Bangladeshi feminism, and also in terms of its visibilizing of women's involvement in the war and in the war effort. So my question really is really to ask you to, or anybody else, and maybe Nayanika and Yasmin in particular, to expand on that and to reflect upon how these forms of violence have affected feminisms in Bangladesh today, and I guess the gender rights agenda within Bangladesh and how that's developed over the last 50 years. Meghna,
okay, I think I will answer, but I'll keep my video off because of the connection. Thanks, Katie. That's a great question to start off with. I think one of the examples I can give you about the invisibility, how visibilized it is or not. For example, you look at the War Crimes Tribunal that has taken place recently, and the whole question that feminists are making is why wasn't the except for a rape and a murder case, why wasn't rape addressed in such in that tribunal? Very interestingly, I was approached by the investigation department because they did ask me, because my mother was actually a member of the relief and rehabilitation, the institution that was set up Nari Punorbashan Kendra, and they came to me to ask me whether I have any papers regarding that. So when it was the investigation stage, so it seems that rape and the rehabilitation of women, etc., they did have a focus, but it got lost in the prosecution. So from the investigation, when it was transferred into prosecution, it did not appear. Why did it not appear? Even we do not know the answer, and that is something that we need to look into. So constantly we see that there is a trend to make it more visible, but again, it's somehow or the other, and exactly where does it get invisibilized or even get normalized? In the case of, as I said, that it wasn't only the 71, it's 71, what happened, it went forward. If you look at other issues like the Chittagong Hill Tracts and sexual violence in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, even in other communities, marginalized communities, land grabbing instances, all these have sexual violence, and time and again it gets normalized or invisibilized. And this is something that I really want to bring up, because when we want to get the root of the violence, of the sexual violence, we tend to go into either sort of institutional mechanisms like the state, the court, and also, like civil society organizations and transitional justice mechanisms. But we tend to lose of the societal dynamics that Nayanika was a bit touching on. And I see that dynamics working time and again to normalize the violence in the form of shame, in the form of blame, and in the blaming the victim, and in the form and many other forms which we are not, sometimes even we normalize it ourselves. So very interesting. I think this is the way for future research to take on, and for the new generation of young researchers coming on. I think it's a very important way to go forward.
Well, thank you, Meghna. Nayanika, were you hoping to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I can say a lot, but I'll be brief because I'm sure Yasmin also has a lot to say. Actually, I mean, what happened with the women, I mean, often people would ask, how come such a policy was taken by the government, right? Which has not been done till date. And that the manifestation of that on the ground might have been varied in terms of whether people took on that term or not. So I write at length in the book about the term Virangona and the various connotations it has had based on my research among different kind of people and the different stories that are there around it. But I think at one level, it was seen as a kind of departure to be a new nation state based on a certain kind of gender template around women. But also, I think there was a logistics of a large number of women involved. The women had to be absorbed back. The numbers were large. But to the extent that the ones who were not accepted to keep in the country were the children. So if you look at the newspapers at that time, the government is very explicit wanting to send the children who come through the system of rehabilitation away from the country. And in fact, some of the adoptees are here today in this event as well, as far as I know. So people were sent off, but the women were absorbed in. So there is a certain logistical issue, but also there was a certain attempt as a gender template. And the very institution of abortion, when it was not legal in Bangladesh, in fact, Michelle Murphy's book really shows an amazing way in which the experimentation of the West happens in Bangladesh that story travels back to North America, is a really insightful way of connecting 71 to the kind of population control story going on in Europe and North America. The abortion, the adoption stories, and also if you look at the government documents around women's work and the rehabilitation program, which in fact Shireen, the person I mentioned, she gave it to me by chance, is a document which really lays out the foundation for what would maybe today be kind of women's security action plan. but this was happening as early as 1971 and was, I think, very, very revolutionary in loads of ways. I mean, it gets changes in different ways, but it again resurrects itself in the 90s and makes those connections all over again.
Oh, thanks so much, Nayanika. Yasmin, would you like to say something on this particular question?
Yeah, when I started my research, I hadn't gone looking for particularly a gender history of 71. I was more interested to understand what had happened to ordinary people, because this research was really taking shape around during the time of the Iraq War. US had just attacked Iraq. I was a beginning level assistant professor, and I started thinking, what happens to people in war when we go to war? And that's how I entered the field. And when I walked into Bangladesh and started looking at, as a traditional historian, started looking at the archives, that was an absent story. And so I got interested in the absence. But since 2002, 3, since the research when I was doing, as you can see, there is a huge amount of now awareness of the women's role, not simply as being victims. I don't want to talk as women as victims, because women have incredible resilience. Even what Nayanika showed, one woman took the responsibility of her entire household to protect them. And I won't call it a sacrifice. I won't call it a martyr. I will call it that women just acted as agents of what was needed to be done. And I think that agency has always been there in East Pakistan, today Bangladesh, and it continues to be. So your question was, how has feminism been affected? And I think feminism is not a new thing in Bangladesh. The war was an interlude, and it sort of created another kind of transition to think about what is the space for women. And that space has been gingerly created, but women are claiming that space. And as you can see, 3 women on this panel are all talking about women's issue. You know, only Meghna Didi is from Bangladesh. 2 of us are not from Bangladesh. So, but the men have all talked about big actors, big state players, big, the big narratives of history. To me, the gender divide of what we see and what we, as Meghna talked about, visibilize, and history itself is a question as a role as our scholars, not simply what people do, what women do to affect change. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. That's 3 wonderful answers. Thank you so much. And it actually leads to my second question, which was about the stories that we're not hearing. So you mentioned that you talked about absent stories, Yasmin. So I just wanted to put to the whole panel reflections upon what might be the other stories that may have been silenced or simply never heard, that come out of 1971.
So can I come in on that very briefly?
Yeah, great.
One story that I do talk about in my book, and which has been spoken about, in fact, Tanvir Mokamal has made a film about it, but not enough is spoken about, is the treatment of the Urdu speakers. I don't want to call them Biharis, although that's a known term in Bangladesh, or former East Pakistanis, or the Camp Geneva syndrome. But they had a long struggle about trying to get an identity, a citizenship, and documentation. And their struggle was quite unique. So yes, it's possible to see it as, Bengali nationalism as an important component, but the very fact that, once the independence was achieved, what happened to those who may have been bystanders? I mean, the assumption that everybody who spoke Urdu was a supporter of West Pakistan was not my personal view, was not a correct one. So I think that's one story. I think the role of the Santals, the role of what happened with the Chakmas, both in terms of the history in the past and also during the Chittagong Hill Tracks and its aftermath, these are all stories that are continuing ones. And if you look at the Kaptai Dam and what happens at that time, I mean, it's not simply a story about ethnicity upon ethnicity, but it's also about hills people versus plain people. And this is the kind of story that continues even in India. In northeastern India. So those are the kind of stories we are not hearing. Also, the kind of stories we are not hearing are indeed about the kind of nationalism Bangladesh wanted. I mean, what kind of secularism it wanted when it wanted to become Bangladesh. I think that's another area where people, and I think the whole unpacking of Bengali versus Muslim or Bengali and Muslim, what it means, is worth doing it. And in defense of my book, yes, of course, you've all done superb work on documenting what happened to women in the war. My book does have a chapter on sexual violence. I just thought I'd mention that. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Salil. I wonder if somebody else would like to come in on that question of absent voices.
I will just come in with, it was in Pakistan that I heard some very interesting stories which are completely absent from the national narratives of any India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And I won't go there, but what I want to tell you is in the private space again, it is the women. It is not the Asma Jahangir or Mazhar Ali's and all of that I'm talking about. These are women who are wives of just ordinary soldiers, who talk about something very interesting of the changes in their man and the conjugal life after the men have returned. And how the families have kind of have to deal with this fact, because the men who were just ordinary soldiers have become more or less depressed cases and cannot perform the duties of a husband. That is never talked about. What are the destructions on women's life in Pakistan post 1971 of the ordinary people I'm talking about?
Nayanika.
I wanted to actually following Yasmin. I have worked extensively with the husbands of the women as well, and the kind of issues of demasculinization that emerges in various instances are important aspects to be talked about. And another thing that might not arise that much and is the issue of male sexual violence, which I have a chapter on in my work, in terms of the role of photographs being captioned wrong, or all of that has also gone on within the archival narrative within Bangladesh. And the third thing, I think, which is really important right now for Bangladesh and for its future, is the role of the adoptees within the Bangladeshi nation. So there are a group of adoptees. If the Bangladesh High Commission is listening to this, we have been trying to get these files to their required, owners, like the adoptees whose files they are. And there's been a huge blockage about it, that these are the citizens who left the country in Bangladesh, want to come back and find out more about Bangladesh, want to live here. And I think Bangladesh's future also lies with the adoptees who left the country, and the government should do as much as possible to make that easy and possible, along with the right checks.
Meghna,
can I add?
Yes, it'd be great if you could.
Yes, well, I'd like to say a little bit about my current work, which is about after 50 years, that my father was killed in the war. So after 50 years, I started to write about it. And it's only at a very minuscule stage at the moment, but my mother did her memoirs. But in doing that, in going over after 50 years, going over my whole life during
Meghna, we're losing you again, unfortunately. Maybe Nilanjan has also gone from my screen. Maybe Nilanjan, we should turn to some of the other questions, and unless somebody else on the panel wanted to come in, and then Meghna could come back when we get her back on the question I asked about untold stories. Okay, we've also lost Nilanjan, and I know that he has these questions from Facebook, which I don't have access to.
So in the meantime, I'm going to fill you up with another story that's not talked about.
Thank you, Yasmin. That's very kind of you.
And Salil had talked about the Bihari community, and that's how I actually first entered the field of 1971 studies, was the Bihari community. But it was in Pakistan that I heard the most incredible story of what is not talked about, and that's what my book became, from a Bihari woman living in Orangi, which is a slum in Sector 11, who's talked about the death of her husband, and then being in jail in a small place called Khulna, where 2 of her daughters died of starvation. And after her daughters died, they had to throw their bodies into a drain because she had no money to bury them. And at the end of that, she said, they were human too. That's what is not talked about. The loss of humanity in this war, where human beings became garbage. It doesn't matter what ethnicity, what religion, what nationality card you carry. At the end of the day, it is a brutality that people did to one another and the inability to talk about it.
Thank you, Yasmin. Meghna, we lost you and we're hoping that you can come back. Are you still there? You were telling us about your mother's memoirs.
Yes. And basically, I wanted to talk about urban warfare is something that is missing. How Dhaka under siege, and the dynamics that went into it. You know, at one time you would see rickshawallahs and vendors who would be talking English sometimes, and there would be freedom fighters, and you would hear of middle-class women going out with their brothers to do an operation, but staying in the car with the baby so that no one recognizes. You know, little stories which are told in ample details in World War II and in World War I, World War II, and none of it is being told in the Bangladesh context. What went on inside, a little bit exists in memoirs, but I think again it is something that needs proper attention of a researcher.
Well, Meghna, we're really going to look forward to you writing some of that. So let us know when it's out. But Nilanjan, I'm going to pass on to you now because I think that you have some questions from the audience. But thanks you to everybody who, for answering my brief questions. Thanks.
Did Gary get a chance to answer?
Gary, did you have? He didn't. I didn't see him unmuting himself and didn't message me.
No, that's fine. Why don't we get on? Why don't we get on to the audience's questions? If
I
that's
think so.
Okay, great. What I'm going to do is I'll read out the questions and I'll go two at a time. Nayanika, one is there for you. One is there for Srinath. I'm going to withhold the names of the people who've asked the questions because at LSE and for on-site events, we give audiences the option of not telling their names when they ask a question. And since we haven't had, taken consent, even though those on Facebook can see who's posing the question, but at least from the side of LSE, we should maintain these rules. Srinath, the question for you is this. I'm going to sort of paraphrase it, but I'll read out most of it. The question is this. Couldn't one argue that the lopsided partition of the Raj, where both East and West Pakistan were both less well off than India, resulting in economic inequality between the two Pakistans, essentially predetermined the break between the two Pakistans, that's East and West? After all, Bengali leaders railed against the economic inequality strongly as there wasn't enough money for both West and East Pakistan's development. That's a question for you. Nayanika, I'll read out your question and then you can answer it because I don't want to keep on interfering. This question is more about the category. Okay, so here it is. Could you shed a bit more light on the concept of Birangona? It doesn't, I'm going to read this slowly because there's a lot being said here. It doesn't necessarily embody valor. It adds the wound, as you, that is Nayanika, say in your book, the wound not necessarily that of a war fighter. It symbolizes stigmatization. The nomenclature even signifies collective forgetfulness and or, that there's a / acceptance of the women who have wronged, on whose bodies atrocious crimes had been committed. So Srinath, then Nayanika.
Thanks, Nilanjan. Yeah, so on the question of economic disparities and whether they determine the outcome, as a historian, the immediate response that I have is, how then do you explain the timing of these things? Right? I mean, why does it take until 1971 before these so-called structural economic inequalities then result in some kind of a rupture, right? As far as the broader question is concerned about the economic sort of background to the emergence of Bangladesh, I think it's again worth reiterating that the critique of the united Pakistani economy as effectively a neo-colonial economy dominated by the West, with the East being providing the sort of primary agricultural commodity exports, which in turn earn revenue, which is being channeled towards industrialization in the West. This entire sort of paradigm was actually pioneered, interestingly enough, by Bengali economists working with the Pakistani Planning Commission in the 1960s. And we have to also remember that this happens not in the context of a continued situation of economic sort of deprivation, but actually of economic growth in Pakistan. We tend to forget that in the early 1960s, under the Ayub Khan sort of dictatorship, Pakistan actually registered significant amounts of growth. I mean, 6% per capita, 6% per annum GDP growth between 1961 and 1968. That really is, so in a sense, if there is an economic dimension at work here, it is more the Tocquevillian sort of, revolution of rising expectations kind of story rather than one of stagnation continuing from 1947. So I find that to be a difficult one to remember. And once again, the argument that I'm sort of sketching out for you brings us to the fact that we have to look at effectively the late 60s as the turning point, which is the burden of my argument and books.
Nayanika, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, this has been a struggle throughout the term which ends up effacing while it's naming, right? It has while naming it, it gives it visibility, and as a result ends up stigmatizing. And Malika Khan, whom I've worked with very closely, one of the social workers who worked with the women and the survivors, is against the use of the term Virangona, but at the same time, it has been a struggle to know what exactly to call them. So there was attempt to say, let's call them women liberation fighters. Now, many of the women I worked with, we were talking about that, and they said, we have struggled and come out as Virangonas. We don't want to be covered up as women liberation fighters, which is often the term now being used by the government itself. So there is a constant juxtaposition and shifting of goalposts through these very names itself. There is no perfect solution. But I felt the term, I've continued to use the term Virangona with all its caveats, with all the apologies, and with all the pitfalls that comes with it, only to say that this was actually at the point when it was saying that the women were casualties of war. What happened to them was, if they were not fighting, this is part of what happened because of the war. So this is, I still think it was a pretty amazing position taken by the government at that point in the early 70s. And that is why I've stuck to using it, but with all the apologies at the same time. I don't have a perfect solution for it. And I've got an extensive account of it in terms of the very, very derogatory versions of the term and all of that played out in Bangladesh as well and still plays out.
Thank you very much. We are running slightly short time. But I will press on with the questions. Meghna, can you hear me? Meghna may not be there, so I'm not going to pose.
Hello, I can.
Okay, great. So there's a question for you, Meghna, that I'm just going to read out. Could you comment on the role of many? Yeah.
No, I can't.
Okay, what I'm going to try and do is I'll read out another question that's there. And Meghna, your question, I will type out in...
it's better not to, internet is very unstable.
Okay, all right, shall we then just go on to another question? Is that fine? I'm sorry to the person who asked the question to Meghna, but Meghna's internet connectivity is just too unstable and she cannot hear me consistently, unfortunately. There's a question that is addressed to no one. So I'm just going to read it out. Do you think there are any present-day parallels to 1971 in South Asia? This is directed mostly in the context of sexual violence committed against Kashmiri women or women in general, but issues that are not talked about. So do you think there are parallels. I mean, one could open the question up and, you know, look for parallels, not just in the context of sexual violence and violence against sexual violence against women, but even others, because this was something that that has come up in different ways in discussions over here. There are a lot of comments on Facebook, which I'm obviously not reading out because they're not questions, but would any of you like to respond to that?
I mean, what one could say, there are these parallels in various instances in the subcontinent and other parts of the world. For me, it's been important to see how, when it happens, how governments and society deals with it. For me, it's been the post-conflict instances in which these instances are addressed, and what happens to society as a result of this has been more my focus, rather than looking for instances where, so I've read work around Rwanda, Bosnia, and I keep on working on looking at stuff from Kashmir, Chittagong Hill Tracts. So it's how societies respond to it would be the way I would come to it.
But I would go back to what Srinath was saying earlier, is the conditions and circumstances. And I don't think there is any country in the world which is divided into two and is geographically separated by another country in between to produce conditions like 1971 anywhere else. So I think we have to look into those the end of colonialism and the post-colonial constructs of nation states. And is there any kind of similar nation state like West and East Pakistan with India in between to produce?
Okay, there's one more question, which is to Srinath in particular, which is that, you know, in the course of your research, did you notice within the documents that specifically dealt with India, the Indian documents, anything regarding local collaborators and the trials of 1972-73? Did you notice any?
Sorry, I didn't get the question. About local collaborators
and the trials of the 1972-73 period. That's what it says. Okay. What sort? Okay, so I'll read it out exactly as it is. What sort of discussion do you notice within the Indian documents regarding the local collaborators and the trials of 1972-73 period?
Ah, okay. I get it. They're talking about the Razakars and that thing, right? I mean, so see and again, I think this is an important issue to bear in mind, given that, you know, these war crime trials, etc., really have, you know, been underway over the past decade. To say a good 40 years after the events of 1971. And part of the reason for that was primarily, again, more to do with international politics and the situation of Bangladesh than anything else. Basically, you know, the entry of Bangladesh into the United Nations was vetoed twice, or what it was blocked twice by the People's Republic of China at the behest of Pakistan, which was its ally. And the condition that Pakistan effectively, Zulfikar Ali would effectively force upon Furukraman and the Indians was that not only would the 90,000 odd prisoners of war, Pakistani soldiers, have to be repatriated back home, they would have to be in any case under law, but that Pakistanis would not in any way, you know, acquiesce in the war crimes trials of about 180 Pakistani officers and non-commissioned officers who were supposed to be tried by the Bangladesh. And that would have also led then to the trials of the collaborators. But all of this had to be eventually put in, you know, on the back burner by Mujibur Rahman in order to secure international recognition, which was absolutely critical because at that point of time, Bangladesh had recognition. You know, if you think of the bigger countries, it's only from India and the Soviet Union, and of course, there are other countries like Bhutan. So once again, here you see how the international context really shapes the way in which these discussions took place. And eventually, in 1974, when Sheikh Mujib goes to Pakistan for the Organization of Islamic meeting, you know, he kind of more or less agrees to put this issue behind it. And that paves the way for Bangladesh's entry into the United Nations and into various kinds of other flows of aid, which really needed, which say a neighbor like India was not solely in. So again, it was a very difficult decision. Because the government was very keen to go ahead with these trials soon after the war had ended, but they had to.
Okay, well, we are sort of 5 minutes over, but nonetheless, would each of you like to say something by way of closing comments? Should we start? Meghna, now that you're back, can we quickly get you to make some closing comments?
Well, I get into trouble when I talk, it seems. But thank you very much, the panelists. I'm sorry I couldn't take the question from the audience, but thanks very much for everything. And I hope that this sets forward a journey which will be continued in the coming months. And I'm sure that you will get more and more talented people on board to discuss their work, because there have been many. And it's I think an optimum time to bring all the work together into a kind of a assessment and a review and an evaluation of what went on, as well as what can we do in the future. Thank you very much.
Okay, Meghna, I'm going to cheat and quickly ask you the question, since your connectivity is good at the moment. Right. So the question to you is this: could you comment on the role of many of yourself and many Bangladeshi women, many Bangladeshi feminists? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
In the Tokyo Tribunal, also the role of Bangladeshi women in discussions of international sexual violence and the foundation of the International Criminal Code. So could you say something about it?
Yeah, not much time, but in terms of the tribunal that occurred, there were many women I know who has given testimony, and Nusrat Rabbi is one of them I know. And it's very crucial for them, especially the women, the daughters of the families who had lost their loved ones. A lot of staff are women. The police, many police women have been engaged in the whole, investigation. And finally, as I said, in terms of the subject itself, was women, the rape of women, that has not been able to come out. But there has been much discussion in the civil society, in scholarship, in different in academia, and have started a polemics really I think which can continue in the future. In terms of international criminal court, of course, I think the foundation, as I said, that 71 has been a foundation to questions of sexual violence and impunity. And for example, the Rohingya problem has been, I myself was a member of the National Human Rights Commission at the time the influx came in, and I myself went in to gather testimonies. And I remember that it was the National Human Rights Commission which first said that it was genocide, because we as a nation could recognize genocide, especially the taking testimonies of women. We saw a lot of ourselves in what we saw. And the Bangladesh civil society has gathered together a group to form a support group to see through and be a watchdog at the ICC on the accusations that have been aimed at the Myanmar military. So we have not stayed limited to 71. Our experiences have taken us forward. And there were many, and Nayanika said, there were many women, Biranganas or war heroines who have given testimony in international forums. Thank you.
Thank you. Gary, do you want to say something by way of closing remarks?
Yes, I'm delighted to. I think one thing that sort of stays with me is the importance of taking a hard look at a country's own past, even when it's painful and even when it's uncomfortable, that I think that's a healthy exercise for any society, to look at the unheard voices, as my fellow panelists were talking about, but to consider the dark episodes in a country's own history self-critically. So for Indians, rather than having a triumphant narrative about 1971 as being sort of the great moment of national triumph, to think about the belligerence and militarism in Mrs. Gandhi's response and think about her own subsequent record. For Americans who are inclined to think that the United States is sort of bestowing liberty and democracy around the world, to look at the actual record of the United States during the Cold War and see all the ways in which the United States has fallen so far short of that. Within Bangladesh, to look at these hard questions, that some of the time the discussion about 1971 turns into a valorization of the Awami League and a sort of, triumphal narrative that can be used to perpetuate a bad form of politics within Bangladesh. And all of that, I think, is best done from within the nation. That I don't think it's as useful to have outsiders criticizing. But part of what I tried to do in my book was point to the ways in which Nixon and Kissinger, I'm sitting here in Princeton, the way that people who were, tax dollars in the United States were going to Nixon and Kissinger's policies. So with that, thank you very much to all the panelists, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Gary. I'm just going in random order here. Srinath, would you like to say something?
Well, I mean, Gary has said pretty much what I wanted to say as well. But I think, anniversaries are important occasions because they focus our attention on certain key episodes. But at the same time, they're also tricky occasions because they tend to sort of blur the not so tight distinction in any case between history and memory and commemoration. And I think the one sort of very important thing for us to remember is that any commemoration of this event, should only be done with a very high degree of sobriety, other than that of triumphalism or any kind of jingoistic nationalism, so to speak. And I think practically all the countries which were involved in this, as Gary has suggested, have difficult questions to answer. India, even though India tends to see itself as one of the victors of the war, I think there are a number of very important questions, not just about the war, but the kinds of policies that India pursued during the war, which had consequences for Bangladesh after the war, which we are yet to come to. So I really hope that 50 years is a person reaches middle age, right? It's old enough for a country to kind of reflecting critically on history, and also thinking critically about what the relationship between history and public memory is, and how we sort of tackle this very relationship. So I hope this anniversary really, catalyzes more scholarship. We've already heard from many of the colleagues on the panel about the wonderful kind of new directions which the study of the is taking. And I really look forward to all that is to come out of the year of deliberation that lies ahead. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Srinath. We sort of lost bits of what you were saying in between, but I think all of us got the gist of it. Nayanika, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I'm also going to paste the link of the graphic novel and the animation film if panelists are interested. It's available online for free. In a recent book blurb I wrote for Anand Zakaria's book on 1971, in some ways I feel 1971 is the rupture that moves the subcontinent more than 47. 71 kind of affects all the countries in the subcontinent in various kinds of ways. And I think the importance I consider myself as an insider, outsider, as a Bengali from Kolkata who's worked in Bangladesh and has learned, all kinds of new things. I would think that, let 71 not be a technology of control, and let 71 and its spirits, the true spirit of 71, be a site of interrogation and contestation and debate, and which will only make everyone stronger, as something I say even in what I teach my anthropology students. So I would just say 71 is an important point of rupture in the subcontinent, and it's important for all of us to be able to discuss about it openly and truly.
Thank you, Nayanika. Yasmin.
Oh, thank you, first of all of you. It was a thought-provoking conversation that we returned to after so many years of doing this research. So it's also difficult to remember the details of what you had found, although they are inscribed in my heart, each and every person that I had met. And it is based on that that I had started thinking, actually, that Nayanika mentioned 47, Gary mentioned about the hard facts of our own nations and our states that we have to, as citizens or even as just people, talk about it. And I think in the case of subcontinent, 47, 71, these are not just dates, they are lives of people. And it is interesting that the borders have moved around as the nation states have taken shape, as this panel itself is called Becoming Bangladesh. A nation had come into being in 71, 47, two other nations had come into being. Borders have moved around, but people sometimes have not moved around, and yet they have become others. They have become strangers in their own countries, which is particularly the case today as we talk about the problem of Bangladeshis in India. Illegal, the non-human, the vermin. This is highly problematic where we are dehumanizing. And I think it is time to start talking about the human in the subcontinent who may be divided into different nation states and citizens of different nation states, but they do have a connected history, which goes back to a deep past. And can we as people talk about those connections without the fear of being unpatriotic? We are patriotic precisely because we are human and we want to connect with other human beings.
Thank you, Yasmin. Salil?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I'm not muted. Yeah, and no, Yasmin, just to pick up on your point, in my book, I refer to one person who had 4 nationalities within 20 years, although he didn't leave his village. And of course, it's Bangladeshi I'm speaking about, and that just shows exactly what you're talking about, that the borders are carved by other people, but people live with the consequences. But 2 points I wanted to make at the end, that we've spoken a lot about the festering wound and the pain, and which is important. But we have to also celebrate a few things. And I think one of the things is that, the famous apocryphal remark about Henry Kissinger, who said that Bangladesh will be an international basket case. That was the term he used when the nation came into being. And how well Bangladesh has proved him wrong. Of course, it's a struggling developing country, where so many of its sons have to go abroad and work, and so many of its daughters have to work in garment factories in not necessarily great conditions. But at the same time, it is in many ways a model of development. Very often it functions in spite of the government and not because of it. And I say it very conscious of the fact that Bangladesh has been rather poorly served in governance over the past 50 years through coups and mutinies and allegations of corruption and so on. So the very fact that Bangladesh has overtaken, particularly India, but other countries in the region in terms of development indicators is an enormous achievement, which at the 50th anniversary, Bangladesh should be very, very proud about. There was a joke in Dhaka earlier this year when the statistics of the economic performance came out, that maybe Bangladesh will now have to worry about Indian economic migrants coming into the country, given the state of the two economies. So there's something to be there and something also to recognize without getting into any jingoism on any side. But there's always a but, right? And the but is what I spoke about earlier, which is are the dreams of 1971 being realized. I spoke about the Asad Chowdhury poem, is Bangladesh today speaking the language that those martyrs wanted to hear? And then when we see the Digital Security Act, the attacks on journalists, the killing of the bloggers and the condition of human rights, and at a time when there's a major story going on internationally about Bangladesh and its military, newspapers in Bangladesh have to write tortured explanations explaining why they cannot say what they wish to say. They're not being able to say what they want to say. And I think that is a problem. That's not the kind of Bangladesh anybody wants, not in Bangladesh, and even those abroad who wish it very well. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you especially because we've gone over sort of more than 20 minutes over our allocated time, but thank you very much for your participation. It's my very pleasant duty now to thank each of you for having joined from different parts of the world. But can I begin with thanking especially Meghna? I think as far as I have counted, she had got disconnected and joined 4 times. And I think that's very important for me to mention. So Meghna Guhathakurta, thank you very much. Gary Bass from Princeton, thank you very much. Salil Tripathi from New York, thank you very much. Srinath Raghavan from Chennai, thank you very much. Nayanika Mookherjee from Durham, thank you very much. Yasmin Saikia from Arizona, thank you very much. Katie, thank you very much for your contribution as well. And we've all enjoyed this very much. I've asked as many questions as I could from the Facebook. I've left out the comments. This is for the benefit of the audience, because unfortunately it's just not possible to fit everything in, but everyone can go back and see the comments on Facebook. Thank you once again, everyone, and goodbye.